Good morning, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Dr. Stacie Pettyjohn, the Director of the Defense Program at the Center for a New American Security. Joining me here today at the CNAS virtual Fireside is the Honorable Frank Kendall, the Secretary of the Air Force. Welcome, Secretary Kendall. Thanks for being here. I'm going to try to run through our introductory remarks quickly because we only have 45 minutes today to have this conversation, and I'd like to include as many audience questions and comments as possible, as well as cover a range of topics that I'm really interested in. So this is a live and public event that's going to be recorded and available after the fact. If you have a question, please insert it in the chat box at the bottom of the screen, or join the conversation on Twitter at #CNAS2022. You need to identify yourself. We do not accept anonymous questions. So with that, let's dive into the substance. The Space Force just celebrated its second anniversary, its second birthday in December, really. Can you talk a little bit about how the Department of the Air Force as a whole has changed and is reorganizing to manage two services?
I think, first of all, it's not a fundamental reorganization. It is a change. I've been very impressed with what General Brown and General Raymond have done to set up the Space Force and organize it and organize that relationship and establish a solid relationship between the two services as well as with the Secretariat. But we are looking at those arrangements, and we'll be doing some fine-tuning and tweaking. We want the Space Force to be an independent, separate service, but we also want it to stay as tightly coupled to the Air Force and Department of the Air Force as is necessary for it to be a success. And that's a very important consideration. The Space Force is very small in terms of numbers of people. It's very large in terms of its importance. But in order for it to be successful, it's going to need a lot of support from the Air Force and also from the Department of the Air Force. So we're trying to make all those arrangements work as effectively as possible. And there'll be a continuous evolution as we learn from our experience. But I think we're in a pretty good place.
Good to hear. As you said, it's really important for the two services to remain tightly coupled. This is integral to the operating concepts that you're coming up with, plus just day-to-day operations between the two that are housed under the same larger military department. The Space Force has taken this opportunity to try to develop its own culture that's distinct and potentially makes it an agent of change within the broader Pentagon culture. Can you talk a little bit about what they're trying to do and how you see that meshing with the Air Force's culture?
Sure. I mean, it's an advantage to the Space Force because of their relatively small size that they can affect change much more easily than the much larger Air Force itself or even the Secretariat. So I think they can be an experimental area or a pilot for things that we can broaden and expand to greater scale. One of the areas that they're working on is digitization. General Raymond's talked about it being a digital service. I think that's a worthy goal and one that the rest of the department hasn't really caught up with yet and hasn't done as much as it could in. And there are a number of other areas. So there's an attempt to establish a unique culture, but also to keep it tightly coupled to the Air Force as a whole.
Great. So let's turn to, I think, one of your focus areas, which has been modernizing both the Air and Space Forces so that they can better deal with the pacing challenge, which is China. You've identified a number of different operational imperatives, areas where the two services need to make improvements to be able to strengthen deterrence against China. Can you provide an overview of what your imperatives are, and then we can dive into each one a little bit more in detail?
Yeah, I'll walk through them really quickly, Stacie. There are 7 right now, and it's an evolving list, but it's essentially to focus our analysis efforts on what I consider the greatest operational challenges that we face. I call them imperatives because they're things we have to be able to do and we have to get right if we're going to be successful at providing deterrent and, if necessary, war-winning capabilities. I'll just do the list real quickly for you, and then we can talk about them in more detail. The first one is a broad one. It's the resilient space order of battle and architecture. We recognized several years ago that space was a contested domain and that we had to take aggressive action to protect our assets in space and also to deal with the threatening assets that potential adversaries might have. So getting that order of battle right, and it's a very much a new order of battle, replaces the legacy one, is the first one. There's a lot of work still to be done there, a lot of work that has been done, but there's still a lot more to do. The next one is to take the idea of the advanced battle management systems. The Air Force is part of the Joint All-Domain Command and Control, and focus it on the things with the highest operational payoff. I think that the general move in this direction, use of more integrated capabilities, if you will. Some people call it an Internet of Things for the battlefield. It's the right general direction, but I don't think enough focus has been placed on figuring out exactly where to invest and in what to give us the greatest operational return. So that's what the second one is all about, is better definition and more focus on ABMS. The next one is the system of systems that'll be the next generation of air dominance. And none of these are really totally independent of each other. They're all very much tightly coupled. This is a good example of that. But there's been a fair amount of work done to define what the follow-on to F-35 and F-22 might look like, but also to determine how that platform, if you will fight in a system of systems context. And that system of systems, to me, includes unmanned platforms. It includes off-board sensor systems and how they communicate with an NGAT-centric capability, as well as how we do battle management for a larger force associated with that capability. So it's to define in more clarity what else we need besides an advanced platform that is the follow-on, if you will, to F-35 and F-22. The next one is the fourth one, addresses the need for us to do target acquisition effectively at scale. And that's ground moving target indication and air moving target indication. I mean, the two principal sets of targets the Air Force worries about in the conventional warfare. One is things on the surface, mobile tells, for example, and ships at sea. And another is the things in the air, aircraft of various types that are targets. And how we acquire those targets, the whole idea of ABMS starts with the acquisition of the things that we need to worry about as threats, and giving us high quality information so we can prosecute those targets, those threats effectively as possible. So this is a sensor focused, if you will, but it's also a network piece to this. The next one on the list is resilient basing. We have allies who are close to our potential threats that we're pledged to help defend. And we need to be able to do that from their territory in many cases. So we're going to continue to use tactical aircraft that are operating out of bases that are located in places like Europe and in the Western Pacific. And those bases, because they're generally fixed, are vulnerable to potential attackers who already know where they are. And so we have concepts like agile combat employment that are designed to make that problem harder for an adversary. But that is a piece of the solution, but we have to figure out exactly what investments we need to make in the mix of defenses, hardening, deception, and proliferation. And so the next one gets at how to make our basing forward, in particular, more resilient. We have, I think, identified the need to do that, and we've made some progress in that area, but we have to be much more specific about the needed investments and allocate resources to them in a cost-effective manner. So that's the next one. The next one is another fairly broad one, and it's the ability to transition to wartime effectively when you look at the complete collection of things we depend upon to go to war. And we have a deterrence-based strategy that is backed up by the ability to fight effectively if deterrence fails. And being able to fight effectively depends upon mobilizing our force, moving it to where it needs to be, supporting it when it's there. It's a range of capabilities that include some things that can be easily subject to cyber attacks, for example, such as our personnel system or the systems that manage transportation for us, logistics system. So there's a cybersecurity aspect of this one, but it's broader than just that. And it's about looking at, if you will, a kill chain, as we call it, that's writ very large. It's about getting the force mobilized and getting it into operation where it needs to be and supporting it when it gets there. So it's the full set of things we need to transition to a wartime posture and then conduct operations. And then the last one is the counterpart to the NGAT system of systems imperative. It's the one about our global strike capability, our long-range strike capabilities from the Air Force point of view. And it's what's the mix of things that we need there going forward. So B-21 is a central part of that, but it's the system of systems that surrounds B-21 and makes it effective. There's another unmanned uncrewed aircraft piece of this as well. But there's also the network of sensors and communications and battle management that supports that concept. In the case of those two operational concepts, if you will, one around the tactical kind of capabilities and the other built around the longer range, more strategic capabilities, there's this idea of command and control that's effective and a network of things that work together that may have support from off-board outside that system of systems, but is essentially the nucleus of the play, the operational concept that we would have both at the long and short ranges for operations. That's it. That's the 7. It's a pretty broad and all-inclusive group of things we're working on. I've lost your sound, Stacie. I think you're muted.
You would think at this point in the pandemic, I want to do that. It warms my heart to hear you say that. I am focusing on operational challenges. A relatively discrete list is such a sound way to go about building your force structure. And I think those are fantastic. I'm going to choose my favorite to talk about first, because I just had a piece in War on the Rocks on base resiliency and passive defenses in particular. So I'm really excited to hear that you find that to be a priority. In past experience, we've seen that the Air Force tends to habitually deprioritize this. It just, when you rack and stack, when you're making your budget every year, that hardening and concrete aren't things that typically make the cut, and that it's required a high level of senior leadership engagement to do that. Are you, or do you think General Brown's willing to be engaged, or someone else, to make sure that this actually happens? Because there have been plans in place and people advocating for this for a long time now.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is all about allocation of resources at the end of the day. One of the things I'm trying to instill in the Air Force institutionally, and it's a major change from the last 30 odd years, is that we cannot go forward with a presumption of superiority. That our military dominance that we demonstrated in the first Gulf War 30 years ago, that was 30 years ago. A lot of things can change in 30 years, and they have. We still have the best military in the world, and anybody who wants to challenge us should be aware of that and think very, very, very hard about what that means. But at the same time, our potential adversaries, and I focus on China because they have, I think, been the most clear about this. And they've had the resources to invest. So they have noticed, it's quite obvious, that we depend upon a small number of assets, including forward air bases, to conduct operations. And because they're fixed, they're easily targetable. And they built the assets to come after them. So we have got to respond to that. And I'm trying to instill within the whole department a sense of urgency about all of this, that these operational imperatives are just that. They're things we have to do to be successful. And I think to have a successful deterrent, to have a credible threat. And these problems are not, they're already upon us. They're not future things that we have to worry about at some time 5 or 10 or 15 years down the road. They're here now. So we've got to address them with a strong sense of urgency. And the mix, and I think if I were to pick one thing on my list that I think we have to do something about quickly, and it's quite apparent to me what we need to do about it. Just getting the mix right is a question. We have to be harder. We have to create some ambiguity for the enemy. We have to use a combination of multiple locations and deceptions to do that. We have to have some level of defenses so that he has uncertainty about how successful this attack might be. And we have to basically change the equation fundamentally in terms of how much leverage there is in shutting down air bases and a small number of air bases. That to me is probably the most immediate task on the list, and it's one of the easiest ones to conceptually think about what you have to do. And it's more a matter of resources. I mean, there are degrees to which we can do the various things. There are probably minimums, knees in the curve, if you will, from an analytical point of view that we should try to get to. But we need to move out on this. And I will credit what General Brown and the Air Force have done to a certain degree. The agile combat employment concept is the right concept. And we've done some things with exercises and so on to kind of start to make that into reality. We just have a lot more to do, and we need to get on with it as quickly as possible.
Couldn't agree more. That is fantastic to hear that you're making that a near-term initiative. I'm going to try to go back and forth between what I want to ask, and we've already got questions coming in from the audience, so we'll see how I manage. Let's turn to space, the one that you started with. When we think about having a resilient space architecture, a lot of the focus has been on proliferating LEO and developing larger constellations of smaller satellites. But there are a couple of other pieces to this. You might want to improve resiliency by having a capability to responsively launch satellites in space. And then we had a question from Paul by talking about strengthening deterrence in space. Can we do that without having an offensive space capability as well?
I think we actually need both. We need them for different reasons, okay, offensive and defense. We need to protect the services that we provide to the military from space. Space is a domain in which you're not trying to conquer it per se. You use it to provide services to terrestrial forces, generally speaking. That list of services includes the strategic warning and strategic communications, includes tactical communications, tactical ISR, PNT, position navigation and timing, a range of things that our terrestrial services, our forces depend upon, and this applies to all the different services and military departments, as well as to our allies. We provide these services to our allies in many cases, so they're under attack. I mean, we recognize in the Obama, or under threat. We recognize in the Obama administration that we had to change our strategy for space. We had to go to one which recognized that it was a contested domain in which we could not operate with impunity anymore. And that actually was true in my earlier days of my career to some degree during the Cold War. The Soviets had some anti-satellite capabilities, but not nearly to the extent that both Russia and China are fielding them now. So we've had some very visible demonstrations of that very recently, obviously. So we need to get to the right mix. It is a combination of proliferation and disaggregation to some degree. It also can include war reserve capabilities. And it certainly does include the capability to deny potential adversaries some of their capabilities, those services that they use from space. And you look at the threats that are of most concern to us, they've been moving very aggressively to operationalize space from a military perspective. We have an interesting mix in the United States that comes out of the history of the Cold War and so on, where initially we went into space to get strategic warning and to get intelligence on what the Soviets were doing. And we have a system that built up around that. And then we added some military services to the architecture. And so our legacy has a certain heritage. And one of the things we're doing is working very closely with the intelligence community because they provide certain functions from space that the military has basically relied upon them for. And we have to work together to ensure that both our intelligence requirements and our operational requirements for military operations are all met. And I'm working very closely with some of my counterparts in the intelligence community to go forward together on that endeavor.
Great. Let's go from space to ABMS since they're linked. Space is a critical part of networking and enabling ABMS. We had a question from Brianna, which is asking about the status of your ABMS review. She also wanted to know if there have been any changes made to the contract vehicles associated with Capability Release 1, and if there's a timeline for Release 2.
Right now, we're proceeding with Capability Release 1 as planned, and Capability Release 2 is still when we intend to move forward. Capability Release 2 has some pretty broad applicability from the intelligence early warning kind of perspectives. It could be used in different places. It's now you be careful about how much I say about some of these things. What I've been trying to do again is to focus that work on the places where we get the highest return. I think when we got into there's a history to how ABMS and JADC2 both came about that have to do with the cancellation of JSTARS. It happened shortly after I left office. It was canceled, the recapitalization of JSTARS. It was canceled because of concerns about survivability. And I had those concerns. I voiced them before I left. And in a way, it was encouraging to see the Air Force recognizes that was a valid concern and act on it. But there was, I think, a presumption at the time that JSTARS recap was canceled that something called ABMS would fill the gap that would be created by that. I think there's validity in that assumption, but I think also we have to figure out exactly how that's going to be done. JSTARS provided a tremendous wide area surveillance capability for the surface of the Earth. And it was I was in the Pentagon in the first Gulf War. I fought to get JSTARS prototypes deployed to support that conflict. We succeeded in that, and they were remarkably successful, the two prototypes that we had at the time. So I'm a big fan of the JSTARS capabilities, but I understand that JSTARS had survivability issues that we recognized even during the Cold War. So what are we going to replace all that with that's actually going to do that job well, and how are we going to do that? There is, I think, a mix, and this ties into the other initiative or the other imperative on AMTI and GMTI. So we need to get that functionality, but we also need to get it in a way which is cost effective and brings in maybe space components as well as airborne components, manned and uncrewed aircraft as well. So we need to work all that together and get to an overarching solution. The increment ones and particular maybe increment two as well are important things to do on the path to getting that operational capability, but they aren't it. Okay, they're things that get after some of the contributing technologies and contributing capabilities. But I really want to get to the overarching operational architecture and the key things in that will enable things like the two family of systems concepts, for example, that I talked about. I mean, the way we're currently organized is the Air Force uses Air Operations Centers as their fundamental command and control node. Those are at a fairly high level. My intuition is that we have to have nodes at lower levels because those high level nodes can be attacked. They're potentially vulnerable. And we need to maintain continuity in a threatened environment, where we're in a contested environment from the point of view of cyber attacks, electronic warfare attacks, kinetic attacks. So we got to take all that into account and get to an architecture that allows us to provide that kind of off-board support from the point of view of targeting and situational awareness, but also support the operational force at the same time. It's a fair amount of work has been done in the Air Force over the last few years on architecture definition and so on. But I think it's been from a premise that we could get to a grand solution. And I don't think that that's going to be affordable or easily achievable on a time scale that's realistic and meets our needs. So this is about focusing ABMS on the things that are going to make the biggest difference that we can get in a reasonable period of time. So increment one and increment two can be part of all that, but they're not yet, in my mind, the solution to that question.
That all makes sense. It seems like with all domain operations or ABMS, JADC2, all of these things that the United States is trying to offset its quantitative inferiority compared to adversaries like China with really highly networked forces. And as you were talking about our command and control construct and our key nodes right now, it's fairly centralized. My colleague at CNAS, Chris Doherty, has a report on command and information and points out that there's a tension with this effort to further network our forces and our adversaries that are actually attempting to break those connections and to disrupt our communications and degrade our information. How are the Air and Space Forces going to be able to ensure that they can operate in an environment where communications are not assured and where information is degraded?
That's the heart of the problem. I'm an old Army Air Defender from earlier in my career. And there's a sort of doctrine for air defense that you start with very high level control, and then as things get tense and as operations get to much more higher pace, you kind of devolve control down the lower levels where it can happen, ultimately down to the fire unit level. The same thing applies here. The kinds of conflicts we're trying to deter, I've made this analogy before, are more like D-Day than they are like the 8th Air Force's strategic air campaign in Europe. They're very compressed in time. They're very high density, and an awful lot of decisions have to be made in a time scale which is imposed by the operation, and it's almost impossible to imagine that being done at a very, very high level and managing the amount of data. It's also hard to imagine it being done without a lot of automation, a lot of autonomous tools, AI tools, if you will, to help make operational decisions. And at the end of the day, if you can make better decisions at a higher level and integrate your forces more effectively, you're going to get a better result. I mean, that's I think pretty basic efficiency argument. If you can't do that, you end up with individuals making decisions in an individual cockpit about the threat that they happen to see with their own sensors. Right, that's the bottom end of it. The more you can aggregate and make collective decisions and employ your force collectively, efficiently, the better off you're going to be. But I think your intuition is correct in that trying to do that at a very high level, in a very dense time scale, and a very high level of interaction, it can't be done. You've got to go down to lower levels. And so part of this analysis that we're talking about is to figure out where those levels are in the structure and then to design systems around them. And so I think the first step we're going to need to take is to figure out in one of the systems contexts ultimately, but even for the current force, what is that level and how do you do that in a survivable way? The threats of cyber attack, electronic warfare attack, and kinetic attack have all got to be taken into account. And this is a new environment for us. We haven't had to work or think about conducting operations in that kind of a contested environment for a very long time. And one of my observations is that my age is kind of a benefit here. I've had 20 years of Cold War experience worrying about an enemy who was thinking very hard about how to defeat us and trying to apply technology to that problem. And we've got that again. That's where we are today. And for the last 30 odd years or so, we were operating for the most part with an assumption of a presumption of superiority, dramatic superiority that came out of the first Gulf War. And then, of course, we spent 20 years doing counterinsurgencies and counterterrorism operations, which are very, very different than the pacing problem that we have today.
Absolutely true. It seems like there needs to be a shift in expectations about what any sort of conflict would look like with a much more capable adversary. We could keep going on this topic, but I'm going to switch. Let's talk about NGAT a little bit in the system of systems you're looking at there, which includes a mix of manned aircraft and unmanned aircraft. What do you see as the key roles for unmanned aircraft and then for manned aircraft? And do you have new concepts for manned-unmanned teaming that the Air Force is working on?
Yeah, I've described this a couple of times, and this is about all I'm ever going to say publicly about this. I'm starting programs for uncrewed combat aircraft, both at the shorter range tactical level and at the longer range, more strategic level. And if we take the NGAT idea, when I look at what's been done by various programs, DARPA has done a lot of good work. The Air Force has done work on the Skyborg. Some of our allies have done some work. I think the technologies are there now where we can talk about a formation, if you will, of a manned aircraft controlling multiple unmanned aircraft. I mean, the loyal wingman is one version of that. That's at the first end of the scale, just one accompanying aircraft, if you will, uncrewed aircraft, up to say, let's just pick 5 as a number, right? And they operate as a team. They operate as a formation, and they're under the control of the manned aircraft, the crewed aircraft. And that commander, if you will, for that formation calls the play. And then with a reliance on a high degree of autonomy, the other members of the formation operate in a way which is optimized against the threat that they see. That's the concept generally. And the uncrewed aircraft that accompany the NGAT or whatever aircraft it is, could be an F-35 or an F-22 even. They can have a range of capabilities. They can have a range of sensor systems and mission equipment. It's an imperative that they be cheap. One of the cheap relative to the manned aircraft. One of the reasons that I've gone down this road is that if we only do very expensive aircraft for the Air Force, we're not going to be able to afford an Air Force anywhere near the size that we either need or have today. So these have got to be cheaper platforms. And one of their features is that they're at least attritable, if not expendable. That opens up a whole range of tactics that we currently would not contemplate because we'd be sacrificing manned aircraft, and we're not going to do that. So that's the basic idea here. And there's enough technology in existence from programs that we've already conducted that convinces me that that's not a crazy idea, that it's something we can achieve. There's a question of how much, at what scale, and to what extent that we're going to have to work on. But I want to move forward on this in a way which gets us to real operational capability. And so we're going to work with industry. We're going to bring people in. This is going to be largely at a special access program level. And we're going to figure out how to do this as effectively as possible and get on with it. That's the basic concept.
It's definitely true that unmanned aircraft, if they're affordable enough, offer a way to regain mass, which we can't afford with the larger more expensive manned platforms. As a follow-on to that, we have a question from Kevin that is, he's asking about modernization to deter China. And he wanted to get into the role of allies. How do you see the operational role of our vital ally, Japan? In particular, is there confidence that the next generation fighter in Japan is developing, that they are developing, will play an integrated network role together with Air Force assets, U.S. Air Force assets?
It's fundamental to the whole concept of integrated deterrence that we work well operationally with our allies. And so we're going to be a big emphasis on allied participation and allied interoperability with our future force. We already have some shortfalls that I'm working to address in that area that need to modernize, and I'm just becoming aware of some of the things that we need to do in that area and starting to take steps to address them. But there's no question in my mind that one of our great strategic assets as a nation is the liberal democracies, if you will, that are our close partners and allies. I mean, we're seeing that play out in real time right now in NATO with our partners in NATO, and the united front that we're presenting to Russia as it contemplates doing something very, very dangerous and destabilizing in Ukraine. You know, the same thing is true in the Pacific. We have very strong, very close allies in the Pacific. And I think that's something that strength is something we absolutely have to optimize and operationalize as much as we can. And you can see, I think, as you listen to developments from some of our close partners out there, that they're interested in that as well. So it's a very cooperative venture.
Yeah, really have to find a way to bring in the allies and partners to integrated deterrence to actually have sufficient capability to defeat and deter any of these potential adversaries. One of the challenges in the Pacific compared to Europe is just the distances involved and the lack of land, the fact that it's a maritime theater. The Air Force is currently tilted towards a fleet of aircraft that is largely short-range fighters versus long-range bombers. Do you think that mix is appropriate going forward with China being the pacing challenge?
That's a great question. The short answer is I don't know. But I do know that we have to get on with modernizing both of those legs. The Air Force is in a way, and from the conventional warfare point of view, is essentially two Air Forces, short-range tactical Air Force and a longer-range, more strategic Air Force. And we need them both. I mentioned the importance, you just talked about the importance of our allies. Being there is important, okay? The allies are there, they can't go anywhere else. And so being there with them is important. We have to have that kind of capability. And we have to have the responsiveness that comes with forward deployed forces. So we're not going to get away from that. We do have to, as we addressed earlier, make them more resilient, more survivable. But the longer range forces are a very important contribution as well. The U.S. in a way has interior lines around the globe because of those forces. So whether we've got the numbers exactly right in terms of inventory and the balance between the two doesn't worry me too much right now. Because we got to get on with modernizing them both and acquiring more capability in both areas, more modern capability. I mean, the B-21 obviously is underway. F-35 is well underway. It's kind of the core systems in both cases. And NGAT is getting off to a start. And we have a reasonable long-range set of capabilities today that we're going to keep for most of it anyway for quite a period of time. So that mix will evolve over time. And I think we'll be looking at that. But for the near term, it's not really affecting much of what we do because we have to get on with modernizing both legs.
Yeah, got to go with what you have today, at least right now. In terms of one of the things that's great about the operational challenges or the imperatives is that you're focusing on the problems and what you need to do, not the technology necessarily that's needed. You're not just focusing on technology for technology's sake. There's been a lot of attention paid to hypersonics. Mm-hmm. And we have a question from Mark, who's asking about that. It appears that when you look at the United States relative to China and Russia, that we're behind in terms of hypersonic weapons. But you can also think about hypersonic flight being something that could be a useful capability to have. What is the Air Force trying to do to accelerate the pace of hypersonic flight testing in the near to midterm? Are there industry solutions that look promising?
We're working on the technologies. We're working on programs that can deliver weapons hypersonically, but I think we have to be careful about not mirror imaging the potential threats, particularly China in this case. China has a set of targets that I can easily understand why they would want to field hypersonic weapons at reasonable quantities. You know, what China has done over the last couple of decades is field a lot of conventional weapons, ground launch, sea launch, air launch, that can attack the targets that they are worried about, that we present effectively and our allies present, with a mix of cruise and ballistic missiles. They're moving on to a generation, if you will, of hypersonic capabilities to attack some of those same targets. We already have a huge problem with their conventional pre-hypersonic, if you will, range of capabilities. But I can understand why, as we field more capable defenses and as we do things to kind of protect some of our assets, that they would like to have some of the features that hypersonic weapons offer to them. We don't have the same target set that they're worried about. So we have to think about what's most cost effective for us. And while I do think there is a role for hypersonics in that mix, and I think we should continue with and proceed with developing and fielding appropriate hypersonics, I think we have to look very carefully at the target set that we're interested in and at the most cost effective way to deal with it. And I think that's still very much an open question for me. Hypersonics have a couple of features that make them interesting. They get there fast, and they can penetrate defense as well. And there's ambiguity in where they're going compared to conventional ballistic missiles, at least. But they also have the feature of being very expensive compared to conventional weapons. So we got to look at that very carefully and decide where we need to be in that trade-off. And I don't think enough work has been done on that. I mean, there was a rush to hypersonics in the previous administration that at the time I questioned, is this really the right path for the United States? And I still have some of those questions. They're a valuable tool. They can be a valuable asset, but you got to think carefully about where they're most cost effective.
I couldn't agree more. There's a lot of sort of knee-jerk reactions, and they have it, we need to have it, without thinking about the fact that they have posed a lot of challenges for us, meaning our adversaries, with asymmetric capabilities that we don't have a lot of because we have different needs and requirements, as do they. I want to turn quickly a bit to thinking about how the department and whether the department needs to enact further reforms to increase the speed of acquisition of new technologies and weapon systems. This is obviously something you have deep expertise in. There's been a lot of changes that have been made in the last 4 years already to try to accelerate the process of innovation. But I wanted to ask you whether you think more needs to be done. In particular, does the PPBE, the budgeting process, need to be reformed or adapted, or do you have other ideas on how to accelerate the pace of acquisition?
I'll get to that. So let me insert a footnote on the previous discussion. I mean, the fundamental problem the United States has is having a deterrent that defeats aggression. So what we're worried about is the ability to convince an adversary not to do an assault, if you will, whether it's in the Ukraine or it's against Taiwan, for example, in the Pacific. So that's the mission that we have, right? For the core mission. The other side is trying to keep us out of their part of the world or to keep us from intervening. So they're very different views of the world and very different operational requirements from that perspective. So I want to kind of wrap up that previous discussion with that fundamental point. The speed of acquisition. I've been in acquisition most of my life. I started out as an operator and then I got into acquisition, did a lot of that. And I've been listening to operators all my life tell me that acquisition was too slow. I don't disagree with them. I've been trying to make it go faster for about 50 years. It's not easy. And the thing that determines how fast you can go in a new development program is what you're trying to build, which is a question about the requirements that you have. So what I've been advocating for a very long time is a partnership between technologists or acquisition people on the one hand and operators on the other, so that the requirements are consistent with the urgency and the desire for speed, but that they're also reasonable from a risk perspective when you take all of that into account and get the operational capability that the operators really need. So there's got to be a partnership there. And the most effective way to structure a program is to align it with a team. And I've got a number of all of my operational imperatives are being led by a team of acquisition technical people and operational people. But in any event, sit down together and as a team, figure out the best way to move forward to get to the best result that you can get most cost effectively. So my mantra for programs here has been they should be structured to get meaningful operational capabilities as quickly as possible. One or two acute experiments isn't a meaningful operational capability. Let's figure out where we're going to go and get to where we need to be as quickly as we can. Another piece of it is don't go in the wrong direction. Don't start out just going in someplace that sounds good intuitively. Do the analysis, do the careful consideration of the technology up front. Take the time at the beginning to get your direction right, and then you'll get much more quickly towards where you really need to be. To your kind of last point on that, we waste about 2 years not starting. Okay, we waste about 2 years getting money to start something that we need. Okay, in the Cold War, there were cases where we could reprogram sometimes and do things when we saw it, we were surprised, or when we had an opportunity. We need more flexibility to start things early. I mean, it's turn on some contracts with industry to start doing some preliminary design, do some concept analysis, do some operational analysis. Do the things that'll get you down the road towards your ultimate objective, figuring out what that objective is. That's a very cheap part of a program, that front end, but it's critical to getting to the right place at the end of the journey. And it doesn't require you to make long-term commitments. So what we really need, and I've advocated for this for many years, is some flexibility and resources up front to start and get us to a point where we can make better decisions before we commit major resources or we single up on a sole source contractor in some cases, right? So I think we could save a lot of time at the front end. It's right there in front of us. It's obvious place to save time. And what prevents us from doing it are our own processes and the unwillingness of our board of directors to give us the latitude to do those sorts of things and make those kinds of decisions on our own. That would be, I think, to me, the single best thing and the easiest thing we could do if our institutions would allow it to happen.
Makes sense to have a dual-pronged approach, make the process that exists work better, make some key reforms to help. We're running out of time, so I want to ask one last question that's so important. You all, meaning you, the Department of the Air Force has struggled with your proposed budgets on the Hill and getting Congress to support your modernization programs and plans, which involve divesting of certain existing weapon systems that are less relevant for deterring China. What is your plan for convincing skeptical members of Congress about what needs to happen going forward?
My mantra over here has been one team, one fight. And that extends to the Congress. We've got to recognize collectively that we do have threats we have to worry about, and we have to act on that. And part of acting on that is freeing up resources for modernization. And the only place we can free up resources for modernization is if we retire some of our older systems. And there's enormous reluctance to do that. As I went around for my confirmation hearings, every single senator I talked to would say, I agree with you that China is a big problem, but don't take my fill in your blank, C-130s, MQ-9s, A-10s, et cetera. I do want to compliment the Congress and the NDAA that was just passed. A lot of the things we asked to do, with the exception of the A-10, Congress agreed to. So I really appreciate the Congress acting on those requests and giving us the authorization that would allow us to retire some of those older aircraft. We need to move to the next generation in many cases, and we need to do the development work that will help us get there. And that's really the only way that I can see that we can finance it. And the truth of the matter is that our average aircraft is 30 years old. Anybody out there operating a 30-year-old car? I don't think so, unless it's for fun because it's your hobby and it's an antique. So that's not what we have a military for, right? So we do need to get on with recapitalizing the force, essentially. Some of those old aircraft are still going to be very useful. Others are not, and we need to be willing to move forward and make those transitions. And that can be painful. Change can be painful, but it is necessary. I mean, losing is not acceptable. We need to find a way to move forward. And I really do appreciate what the Congress has done so far this year. I'm very delighted with that. Actually, I'm afraid there's going to be more of that required. I'm afraid as we move forward, we're going to need to make additional changes in order to get the resources that we need to modernize. But it is, given the threat that we have, modernization is essential. We can't just live off of our decades-old capital investments. It's not going to work.
Absolutely true. So I'm afraid we've run out of time. Thank you so much, Secretary Kendall, for joining me today. Thanks to the audience for tuning in and for the great questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to more of them. This has been a fascinating and wide-ranging discussion. So have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, Stacie.